What's up, Quarantines? We're here to talk a little bit about time period 6, reviewing the rise of big business and some of its far-reaching impacts to kick off this time period. So let's start. So just a friendly reminder, this time period is 1865 to 1898, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason for all of those dates and why they're important. So we're going to look at the year 1865. Now, that was the year that the Civil War ended. And so what I want to stress is that in the Civil War, this is actually when westward expansion kind of like had its capper. You know, in the decade leading up to the Civil War, the government really couldn't do anything besides discuss the institution of slavery. And so settling Western lands was basically out of the question. How are they supposed to settle westward lands whenever, you know, they can't even figure out if territories are going to have slaves or not have slaves? And so so the question of like land subsidies to westward expansion, how to organize that western land into homesteads or like sellable little blocks of property, how to do that really didn't happen until during the Civil War. And so when the Civil War ended, this time period starts off by mentioning that, you know, westward expansion was a huge catalyst for economic growth. That is going to be the second industrial revolution. So especially railroads and the spread of the railroad industry into Western lands is a major catalyst. That's what kicks off the economic boom that is going to be the second industrial revolution. So keep in mind that the government played a really big role in that. The government gave away all that land to those railroad companies. The government had a huge role in making the success of the railroad industry. But that is oftentimes overlooked. So, you know, the government, people think of the second industrial revolution as like a time of like perfect capitalism almost, or as close as perfect capitalism as we can get. And that's because the government was extremely laissez-faire in that time period. And yeah, there was an economic structure and where there was basically no rules. And, you know, the government in the late 1800s is known as being laissez-faire for that reason, because laissez-faire is like lazy government. That means the government's not doing much. They're not enacting rules or regulations for how businesses are supposed to conduct themselves. There's no minimum wage. There's no workers' compensation. There's no working hour requirements. There's no child labor laws. There's no rules. There's no insider trading rules. There's no limits on corporation consolidation like monopolies or trusts. And so for that reason, the government in this time period is known as super laissez-faire, and we look at the growth of big business in the late 1800s and the second industrial revolution as like the Wild West of business consolidation. And it's true. You know, these businesses were basically operating, they were doing whatever they wanted to do. It was free competition. And if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying, you know? And so basically, in this Wild West of business consolidations, Wild West of who's going to make it and who's going to fail in big business, the government just stayed out of it by way of rules and regulations. However, it's important to remember that the government did in fact take action. And when the government did take action, it was in support of those big businesses. So not only was the government laissez-faire in the late 1800s, it's a good historical argument to make that the government was actually pro-business. It wasn't a neutral, laissez-faire governmental entity. It was laissez-faire, and when it did take action, it took action on the side of big business. And we're going to look at some examples of that here in just a second. So back to these like kind of like the names in big business. You know, there's people like John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and Henry Frick and Vanderbilt, who are rapidly consolidating their business, right? And it's like I mentioned, it's like the Wild West of competition, right? I mean, these guys can basically do whatever they want in order to grow their big businesses. And, you know, there's tons of examples of what that looked like. We watched an episode of The Men Who Built America to see how it actually happened. But a lot of those economic structures were practices to consolidate their businesses that really bordered on fraud, like printing fake stocks. You can't do that anymore. Or giving bribes or like kickbacks to big businesses so that they would use your railroad company versus, and then jacking up the prices for like farmers, for example. So like there would be a lot of unfair practices in like how much are we charging, especially railroad companies. Railroad companies were the first corporations, right? Railroad corporations was the first bits of evidence of this business consolidation. You know, that was the cutting edge of industrialization. People like Vanderbilt and Leland Stanford and Henry Flagler, who were playing the game and winning, you know, and they won oftentimes by cheating, right? I mean, there were no rules, so I guess it's not cheating. But by today's standards, it would definitely be fraudulent behavior that was allowing these companies to consolidate their businesses to become these giant railroad conglomerates. You know, they would build trusts and monopolies, and it was oftentimes at the expense of small businesses who relied on those railroads to ship their goods from one place to another, and farmers, and like your average everyday farmer who relied on railroads to move their grain or to move their corn or to move whatever, you know, crop that they're farming. So you know, there are a couple of examples of what these practices looked like. I think the two most popular forms of business consolidation is vertical and horizontal integration. And so the two like big names of examples for that, historical examples for that, is John Rockefeller is known for horizontal integration, and that's just your run-of-the-mill monopoly. You know, he just buys up all the oil companies. And so basically, if you wanted to buy oil, you had to go to John Rockefeller and Standard Oil Company. And so that's horizontal integration. He owned all the oil, period. Pretty straightforward. Versus Carnegie's a slightly more complex consolidation strategy, which was known as vertical integration. That's where you own all the steps of production. So like Netflix producing their own shows is an example of vertical integration. Not only is Netflix, you know, Netflix, if they want to run like Friends, then they have to go to ABC, purchase the rights for Friends, and then they can stream Friends. Or they could just make their own show like Orange is the New Black or Stranger Things. And so Netflix owns the means of production, and then they also own the service that streams that production. So that's vertical integration. Carnegie owned every step of the steelmaking process, all the way down to the movement of it. So Carnegie, like whatever the process is to make steel, which by the way, Henry Bessemer really popularized that. Carnegie owned all of those processes to that steelmaking. Period, right? That's vertical integration. And so you see like this wild west of business consolidation. Anything goes. John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie were really good at it, right? I mean, they figured out these new ways to consolidate their businesses, to own these monopolies, but everyone was doing it. There were tons of examples of these giant corporations who were just running things, and they were building trusts, and they were blocking smaller businesses from gaining access to their markets. So that business consolidation, understand, you know, it's the consolidation of business so that you have these giant corporations rather than a bunch of small businesses. So basically these big businesses, and the government is working, keep in mind, the government is staying out of it to begin with. And then whenever they do intervene, they're intervening on the side of those big businesses. So that means that our economy is structuring in a way that benefits the mega rich and does not benefit anyone else, right? So like if you're a small, everyday, run-of-the-mill shoe salesman and you want to get into the big shoemaking market, you know, those big businesses are going to make it almost impossible because they don't want that competition. And so the economy is increasingly being restructured to benefit these giant corporations, these giant trusts, at the expense of small businesses, average everyday businessmen, and farmers especially, which we're going to talk about more in the next lecture. So you have this giant, the second industrial revolution, that it's a shift, right? And the first industrial revolution is like the mechanization of farms and textile industries, and like this creeping mechanization that we experienced in the early 1800s versus this bigger second industrial revolution, which is like the production of oil and steel and using these giant mechanized factory systems to produce all of the other American goods. So that starts to get us into the impacts of these big business. This makes production much, much faster. The industrialization of America allows us to move goods faster and farther in less time. That's faster. And it allows us to produce a lot more goods in a lot less time too. So that means that the prices of everyday goods are lowering. Also, there's this new phenomenon with this industrial revolution that's like the need for middle management. Like you need somebody to supervise the factory workers. And so that person becomes like not a poor factory worker, but not a super rich business owner either. He's somewhere in the middle, right? Like, I don't know, like a middle class of people. And so then like, because he's like of the middle class, he goes out and he wants to go to like the store. And so now the store has to expand, and then the store needs managers, or the store needs like workers that's more of like a middle class job. Or, he likes to go to the movies. And so then you develop like these middle class movie workers, and so because there's a creation of the middle class, and the middle class has middle class money to go out and do other middle class things, you see an expansion of a middle class of American people, right? I mean, it's like people who are not super rich, but they're also not super poor. It's like this new middle class, and they have like leisure activities and money to spend and a 9-to-5 job, and kind of what we culturally understand as like the middle class, which we are also going to talk about more in a later lecture. But that middle class is paying attention. And although that middle class exists, which we'll talk about more at a later lecture, that gap between the rich and the poor, though, is widening. So again, the American economic structure has been changed and is being created to benefit the super wealthy at the expense of the super poor. And so that gap between the rich and the poor is getting wider and wider. Although there is a middle class there somewhere in there that fills that gap, for the most part, the rich are getting richer and the poor are not. And so what this leads to is what one of your textbooks called industrial warfare. And so, those super poor people are starting to realize like, hey, it's kind of crap that, we're working hard in all these factories and we're not getting anything for it. Like, these are insanely hard working conditions. We're talking about 18-hour days sometimes for really low wages. There's child labor that's rampant. There's no recourse. If you get your arm chopped off in these dangerous working conditions, then you're just out of luck. They'll just hire somebody else and you are out of a job. So the working conditions are bleak. The urban living environment where most of these factories are located is also difficult, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the culture of these big cities as well. So living and working conditions are not good, and so this leads to workers to want to fight back against this industrial system that is not benefiting them. And so, there's some support amongst the middle class for that. people are starting to realize like they're getting frustrated with trusts. They see trust as old money, as an urban elite. And like the people who are there who have established themselves as mega rich, like the Rockefellers, who that family still exists today, or the Carnegies, or JP Morgan, or the Vanderbilts, these families that have established themselves as mega wealthy and structured the economy as such that makes it very hard for anybody else to access that kind of wealth. People start to kind of resent that idea, and trusts and monopolies are not a fair way to run our economy, especially if we are idealizing capitalistic competition. Monopolies eliminate competition. So people are growing frustrated with that. However, people are also afraid of too much drastic change at once. And so you start to see this labor discontent grow, right? And so the individual laborers start to fight back against these giant industrial conglomerates, and they do so, by going on strike, by organizing strikes, by picketing outside, and businesses fight back in their own way too. So, like some ways that in this industrial warfare, the two sides are set up. There's labor, who has the power of unionizing, which we'll get to in a second, and striking and picketing, and they have the opportunity to sway public opinion in their favor. That's what labor has going for them. On the other side of things, we have big business that used yellow dog contracts, which were like loyalty contracts to make sure that individuals wouldn't join unions. I would say loyal to the company. They would lock out union members. They would blacklist people who were determined to have strikes. They would hire private, security firms called Pinkertons that would basically beat the crap out of people outside if they were striking outside. And then eventually they had the courts on their side, which we're going to get to in just a second, the courts and the American military in several instances. So, that's kind of the stack up of this industrial warfare. You have those methods that the businesses are using, and then you have these series of strikes that the labor movement is trying to wield some kind of power against these big businesses. Now, before we get into those individual strikes, it's important to note that labor discontent coincided with economic turmoil. So whenever you see like an economic downturn, because the economy of the late 1800s is extremely volatile, and that has a lot to do with the lack of government regulation. Whenever the economy is running full force, like with no rules, then businesses are able to act with impunity, which means that you have these like giant boom and bust cycles. So like we have this boom cycle where the economy will grow really, 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 really fast, and then you'll have like a backslide, a bust. So the economy of the late 1800s was very volatile. It ran into boom and bust cycles. And so in those bust cycles, when businesses were having to, shrink back, when they weren't growing, they were shrinking, businesses had to like cut wages or lay off workers or do something like that to protect their bottom line, which is when labor discontent would flare up. So like, for example, the first railroad strike of 1877 happened in a bust cycle. And so wages were cut in railroads, and individuals went on strike. Now, this was done pretty much without the support of like one big union, and it mostly failed. So that's the first example of how a strike coincided with bust cycles. And we're talking about, I got some statistics here, like 50,000 people were taking part in this first strike, despite the fact that there wasn't like a serious union supporting it. So 500,000 industrial workers went on strike to protest economic situations brought on by the economic depression in 1877. And the president, Hayes, actually ordered federal troops to stop that strike from happening. So already you can see that government is intervening. That's not a laissez-faire move, right? That's action taken by the government to support those big businesses. And following this railroad strike, you start to see an understanding amongst workers that, if they're going to be up against the power of not only the companies, but also the federal government themselves, then they're going to have to organize and unionize and join together in order to have more effective, to be more effective against these big businesses. And so you see the formation of a national labor union that is quickly kind of overshadowed by the more popular Knights of Labor. And the National Labor Union was pretty popular. It was an early labor union, but the Knights of Labor is notable because they were ran by this guy named Terence Powderly, and they were accepting of everybody, which is noteworthy. I mean, they included African-American workers, they included women, they advocated for unskilled and skilled laborers to work together in one single union. And so they were open to all, and at the height of their membership, they had almost 1 million members. 730,000 members were in their labor union at the height of their popularity. The issue, though, became with the Knights of Labor that because they were so open and accepting and popular, people got nervous that they were advocating for too much change too fast, and they started getting accused of like anarchism, which is like, oh, let's overthrow the government. And so the demise of the Knights of Labor came with the Haymarket Square riot, in which was supposed to be a peaceful strike in support of workers, and a couple hundred anarchists showed up. I mean, we're talking that was the vast minority. It was actually a May Day protest, which is this week. So May Day is Friday this week, if you're watching it this week that we're setting time period 6. But there were 80,000 people there, and only about 200 of them were anarchists. And so at some point in the Haymarket Square protest, fighting broke out, and there was a bomb that went off, and people died. Specifically, 7 police officers died, and so the Knights of Labor got a bad rap. You know, that middle class I was mentioning earlier that were upset with the trusts, who recognized that trusts were like urban elites, old money, not fair to small businesses. They were not cool, however, with anarchism. And so ultimately public opinion killed the Knights of Labor. And they were replaced by the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, which is still around today, notably. And the AFL was a lot more exclusive about their membership. They didn't accept like unskilled workers. They were more of like a skilled worker focused labor union, but they were a labor union that lasted, at least. And they were led by Samuel Gompers. What a name, Gompers. And they eventually did make it to 1 million members in 1901. However, union membership is going to drastically be decreased, and I have a statistic for that too here in just a second. So, under the leadership of the AFL, though, there's a couple more strikes that are important to know about. One is the Homestead strike that Henry Frick ended up breaking up. He cut wages by like 20% in Andrew Carnegie's Homestead steel plant, and this led to the steel workers going on strike. And eventually, after like 5 months of those steel workers being on strike, they broke up this strike with Pinkertons. So basically, it was violent. The strikers ended up like kind of giving in, and the failure of that strike really set back the demands for steel workers in the steelworker industry. And all those demands that they're laying out, they didn't get until the 1930s, which was actually pretty common for a lot of these labor unions. And so the last one, the Homestead strike ended up not a success for labor unions. And then in a worse defeat, the Pullman strike was about Pullman rail cars. And we talked about this in class. Remember, we talked about how like the Pullman cars, they ended up attaching them to mail cars, and then they appealed to the federal government because the Pullman strike was disrupting the ability for mail to get delivered. And so the government ended up stepping in and breaking up that strike as well. So we're talking about the government actively stepping in and breaking up the strike. So again, when you mention like a laissez-faire government, it's not just that they're a laissez-faire, it's that they are also straight up pro big business. And that's evidenced by the government stepping in and siding on the side of the big businesses, right? They're siding against labor. Not only did the government use their military to break up strikes like the Pullman strike and the railroad strike of 1877, but also the Supreme Court ruled regularly in favor of big businesses over labor unions. So, in the United States versus E.C. Knight, this limited the power of antitrust laws. So Congress tried to pass laws to limit the power of trusts, but the Supreme Court struck those down. So ultimately, antitrust legislation was toothless up until much, much later. And also in Re Debs, which happened right after the Pullman strike, the Supreme Court approved court injunctions, said yes, the federal government can step in and kill strikes. So basically the Supreme Court said, yeah, it's all's fair in industrial warfare. You're allowed to break up strikes. The government's allowed to break up strikes. So, this is the same Supreme Court that ruled Plessy v. Ferguson too. It's a very conservative Supreme Court and habitually ruled in favor of big business over labor unions. And ultimately what that resulted in is By 1900, only 3% of workers belonged to a union. So, I mean, when we talk about this industrial warfare, it's almost unfair to call it that, labor unions and laborers are squaring up against these big businesses. But ultimately, big businesses have the power of the government, money, resources. They have all of the ability in the world to crush labor unions. And they did at the end of the day. Only 3% of workers belonged to a labor union by the year 1900. So that's a pretty significant statistic. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves ultimately is what's the legacy of these big businesses, of these big business leaders? And that's a historiography question that can be supported with a lot of different history. Initially in that time period, people celebrated, because middle-class Americans who were enjoying the benefits of this economic growth were willing to ignore the plight of laborers and poor workers in order to keep their social and cultural comfort. So, in that time period, middle class, university professors, they lauded these industrial leaders as heroes. They were the ones who were so smart and they were so able to be successful. They use social Darwinism to justify themselves as to justify the social structure that was structured to benefit the super rich at the expense of the super poor. But middle class Americans who were enjoying these new luxuries were willing to do that. So in the time period, a lot of university professors said social Darwinism is a thing. These people are super rich because they're so smart. And that's just the way it is. However, that started to change in the early 1900s when, there was which we'll talk about in the next time period, there was a progressive movement to push back against, people were really looking at the underbelly. People like Mark Twain, who called this the Gilded Age, were saying, yeah, it looks shiny on the outside, but let's really look at the underbelly. Well, what's the situation in urban America? Is there equality of opportunity? Look at not only the economic class indifference, the class struggle that was happening in America, but look at what's happening on the front of racism in America, with Plessy v. Ferguson and lynching and the terrorist structures that are existing in the South for Black Americans. And we need to change the way we think about this time period. So prominent historians like Charles Beard said, these people aren't that great. Actually, those workers, those trusts, those business leaders corrupted our democratic institutions and have ultimately ruined equality of opportunity in the American way of life here in America. And so people really started to push back against those. However, in the 1930s and 1950s, following World War II, when there are these big, giant, there's, first of all, a lot of economic growth again, and this big push for patriotism in Cold War America, the pendulum swung back the other way, that we're going to remember these people again as heroes, as they were smart and they did it and they won, and they're the men who built America, and now we're experiencing, since the 1970s in historiography with historians like Howard Zinn and the People's History of the United States, we're again looking critically at these individuals of, how do you remember these people? Do you remember them as robber barons, or do you remember them as captains of industry? Did they do good by establishing the start of a middle class and growing our economy and making America an industrial leader of the world? Or, did they do so? Did they structure an economic system in which it's impossible to get ahead, especially if you're born poor? Did they structure an economic system that only benefits the mega rich, that leads to a growing gap between the rich and the poor, and in which rich people maintain their wealth only by exploiting the working class and exploiting poor Americans? So that's a legacy that we're still debating right now today, and so that's an opinion that you got to have as a citizen in a democracy. So spend some time thinking about it. And if you guys want more information about this, I highly recommend you go check out the College Board's YouTube channel. They have a ton of information about this, hour-long sessions to combat my little 30-minute lecture here. So tons more details and information there. Highly recommend you check it out. All right, quarantines, take care of yourselves.